Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Gunlock, your host for the first ever episode of the Bespoke Parenting Hour, where the focus will be on custom tailored parenting that best fits you, your family, and most importantly, your kids. So I guess the first thing that I should do on this podcast is tell you what I mean by bespoke parenting. What is it? Or even more fundamentally, what in the heck does the word bespoke even mean? And what does it have to do with parenting? That is a good question, and I will try to answer it. First things first, the word bespoke means custom made, and it's usually used when talking about clothing. So bespoke clothing, a really fancy dress or a very expensive suit. It is the opposite of off the rack clothing or ready-made clothing. So, when summer comes around, you need a couple more shorts or t-shirts, you go to Old Navy. There are, 60 t-shirts. They all are exactly the same in different sizes. You pick your size. It fits fine, may not fit perfectly, but it's good enough. That's off the rack clothing. That is a fairly new phenomenon. It really only became ubiquitous in the 20th century. Before that, people made their own clothes. That's why if any of you have ever bought a house that was built in the 1930s or before, you have these bedrooms with one teeny closet. I mean, walk-in closets are a new thing, okay? And these teeny closets were perfectly fine because, people had a couple dresses or a couple suits. They had their Sunday best, but they didn't have a tremendous amount of clothing. And the reason is they either had to have it made at great expense or they made it themselves. And so bespoke clothing still exists. The really big designers have what's called haute couture clothing. And that's bespoke. That is made, that is tailored to the person. And that is exactly what bespoke is. It is clothing that is tailored to your precise measurements. And it fits you perfectly. So how this relates to parenting, you're like, is this a fashion podcast or are we ever going to talk about parenting? So the reason this to me made a lot of sense with parenting is because when I first became a parent, I was, as most new parents are, I was eager to read all the parenting books and all the how-tos and how the best ways, and really trying to understand really what I saw as the best way to parent, but also try to establish a parenting philosophy. And nothing really felt like it quite fit. I wasn't reading something that fit with my lifestyle, with my children, with my needs and wants and desires and hopes. It felt, if you will, like off the rack parenting advice. And I started to think, I need to really come up with my own parenting philosophy that's tailor-made, that fits me and my family perfectly. So that's kind of why I call it the bespoke parenting philosophy. No one knows my kids better than me. No one understands my family's circumstances, my needs, wishes, what I hope for my children, their likes, their dislikes. I am the best expert on my family. So that's why I believe in tailoring of a parenting philosophy that's best for you. Now, I want to be very clear here. This does not mean experts aren't valuable and can't be helpful. They certainly can, especially when it comes to medical questions like vaccines or any health issues that your child might have. Certainly developmental issues. You should really talk to qualified people in that field. And psychological issues. It is really, really critical that you trust people who have studied these issues. I do not want this to be the anti-vax podcast or the I'm just going to feed my children miso soup because I think it protects against measles better than the vaccine, as one Hollywood star said. I think experts are important. What I'm talking about are more of the things that you do every day. Is my child mature enough to walk around the block without me being with them? Can they ride their bike alone to school? Can they go up to the store with a grocery list and $5? When to potty train? When are they ready to get out of their crib? A lot of these decisions should be made based on your own instinct. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about here, is trying to get people to sort of trust their instincts and trust themselves to make good decisions, not totally ignore the experts, but maybe not rely on them quite so much. So that's sort of the elevator speech on bespoke parenting. And we're going to have a lot of guests on to cover those issues, to talk about different parenting strategies, to talk about how they do it. And not to say it's right or wrong, but just to give people a little bit of information. I'd like to also talk a little bit about myself, and I'm going to make this very quick because I don't want people to tune out because they're so bored. But I am the mother of 3 boys, all boys. One is 13. I have a 11-year-old and a 10-year-old. So it's what's called stair steps. I had them one right after the other. So it has... I at one point had 3 boys in diapers. It was not fun. I am married to a guy I met when I was 24 years old, working on Capitol Hill. We now live outside of DC, in a suburb outside DC. And my kids all attend the local school, local public school. We will be talking about that a lot on this podcast because it is just always a source of humor and shock and awe. This year, actually, though, I will be homeschooling my oldest, possibly more. So that, too, will be a great subject as I try to navigate a very new educational system. I'm very excited about it. Luckily, my parents live close by. They are very energetic, very healthy grandparents, and they spend a lot of time with their grandkids, and they help me a lot. So I'm very lucky in that regard. But I will say one of the best things about my life is that I get to work with an amazing group of women who are also my dear friends, 2 of which will be on this podcast today talking about school openings. We all work at the Independent Women's Forum. It is a think tank in Washington, D.C. that focuses on economic and cultural issues. And it is producing this podcast. So thank you to IWF, and thank you also to the producer, Tim, who is a whiz. So I would be remiss if I did not thank IWF for producing this podcast. At IWF, I run a program called the Center for Progress and Innovation, and it focuses, this is like the official line on what it does. It focuses on how human innovation is the key to improving the human condition, and that the modern world is something to celebrate, not regulate into non-existence. So that's sort of the fancy explanation of what the center does, but really what the center does, and in a more common sense language, is I try to reassure moms that the modern world is not going to kill them and their kids. And I know that may sound weird, but you see it every day. Every time you go to the grocery store and you see the organic fruit and you think to yourself, oh, I think that's healthier. Right? So you buy the more expensive organic fruit. Or every time you see something labeled BPA free, you may not know what that means, but I guess I'm supposed to get the BPA free stuff, right? Even though it's more expensive. Or every time you go to apply sunscreen on your kid who's at the beach, right? And you think, oh, is it okay to, I read this article that said that sunscreen causes cancer. So should I do that? Well, the sun also causes cancer. Okay. So use your sunscreen. This is the kind of world that we live in right now, where everything is worthy of alarmism. The most mundane task, from packing your kids a snack to being rushed and needing to get them a quick dinner, to deciding on which apples to buy in the grocery store, is a fraught decision. And you are often told, if you really want to be a good parent or the best parent, or if you want to do it better, or if you want your child to truly thrive, you will buy a particular thing. And often that thing is a product that's more expensive or is somehow missing something that is deemed harmful. Most of those claims are untrue, and they encourage parents to spend more money on items, but they also encourage parents to sort of get behind attempts to ban other products or put restrictions or taxes on other products. That's a cost that affects everybody. So in my Center for Progress and Innovation, we try to knock down those myths that everything in the marketplace is harmful. And so we do it in a very friendly way, in an understandable way, taking on the science and making it a little bit more understandable. I think that fits in well with this podcast, again, because I said parenting in general has become scarier. It's become more intense, more competitive, more judgy. And a lot of this is because of the narrative we hear from the so-called parenting experts, but also non-experts like celebrities and mommy bloggers and green mommies and activists and Instagram mommies. So I hope to have on a few guests over the next year to really talk about that, talk about how parenting has changed, and talk about how it's become more difficult, and talk about how parents really are told there is a right way and a wrong way to do it. If any subject deserves a huge gray area, it is the parenting issue. There is no right way to do it. There is no wrong way to do it. Of course, do not hit your head. Of course, do not, hit your kids, and don't, there's some common sense things we all know. But in terms of, some of the questions about what to feed them and what, their screen time and other things, it really is subjective, and parents need to make the best decisions for their families and for their individual children. Children are, they really are like snowflakes. None are the same, and you have to adapt your parenting style to each child. Each family is going to have a different way of doing that. And as parents, we should respect other people's decisions. So, of course, it would be weird to launch a new podcast on the subject of parenting without talking at least a little bit about the thing that's paramount on every parent's mind: school openings in the age of COVID-19. So, a show of hands. Will it ever happen? My hand did not go up. Before I introduce my guest today, let's talk a little bit about where we are. So I live in Alexandria, Virginia. They made the announcement last month that they will not tell parents the final plans until August 12th. So I have no idea what my child's learning is going to look like. It hampers my ability to make decisions on whether I should pull the trigger in homeschool, whether I should consider private schools. And frankly, by August 12th, you've already missed most of, the online application time. You can't enroll your child in a private school after August 12th. That's just far too late. So my school district is really, I would say, and I use I willingly use this word. It is keeping parents hostage to the public school, because again, in order to make a decision, I need to know the facts. And so the Alexandria Public School District is not telling parents until August 12th. So that is a real shame. Other schools are giving parents some sense. And I think even in the neighboring town, Arlington, they recently they changed the guidance, but they did give the guidance. They gave the guidance in, I think, late June, and said, basically, you have two choices. You can do all online, or you can do a shorter, like just all online for 4 days, or you can do 2 days of in-person learning. And those were two terrible options, but at least it gave parents it gave them a sense of what the options were. And at that point, the parents could say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to homeschool, or I'm going to go to a private school. At least they knew. Arlington has since walked that back, but they walked it back I think 3 days ago. So again, there's still time for many of these parents to make other decisions. And when I say walk back, they said that there will be no in-person learning. So Arlington is going to go entirely online. And that is what a lot of school districts are doing. And I think the ones who haven't announced will probably do that. We've seen some renewed calls to shut down. Several states have reversed reopening plans and are now shutting down businesses for a second time. There has been an uptick of cases due to the Black Lives Matter protests, as well as many of the large gatherings, the Black Lives Matter gatherings. So we have seen an uptick in that. What nobody seems to be talking about is, are we seeing an uptick among young people? It's clear that we are not. We are seeing an uptick in the same demographic that are vulnerable to this disease. The decision of whether to open the schools has also become quite political. We've seen, President Trump and Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos urging schools to open, but that is not popular with the Democrats, who seem to just react opposite to what Trump says. I, in fact, wish Trump had said, let's close down, because maybe then the Democrats and the teachers unions would have said, hey, no, let's open up. It's like opposite day with Trump. Whatever he says, they say the opposite. So I was sort of hoping, I was thinking maybe if Trump says, let's keep them closed, these two, officials, these two groups, the Democrats and the teachers unions, but I repeat myself, would urge a reopening, but they have not. The teachers unions are saying that schools should remain fully closed. Many Democrats, Nancy Pelosi and many other Democrats in leadership are saying the same. Also, of course, the Never Trump contingent is echoing that. What's interesting, though, too, is we had an announcement from the American Academy of Pediatrics. This is the professional organization for pediatricians. They came out with a very strong statement in favor of reopening schools, but then the teachers unions jumped all over AAP for having the nerve to suggest that, and said all this stuff about how teachers are going to be in grave danger. And so the AAP sort of said, well, only reopen if things are, going to be safe. Well, of course, nobody thought the AAP was saying, you should reopen, with no cleaning guidelines, with no distancing guidelines. I think it's pretty clear that when Trump and Betsy DeVos say open the schools, they mean, with appropriate, guidelines, social distancing or wash stations, or, the kids not moving around the classroom, certainly putting some steps in place to ensure that there's a lower risk of transmission is obvious. It's been very interesting to read some of the articles on this. New York Times has done some great coverage on how the online learning hurts minorities and poor children. Just this morning, school districts also have these new problems. Like I saw this just this morning in the Washington Times, that school bus drivers, there's a massive shortage of school bus drivers. Some are not going to return. And so how do you transmit these kids? New York Times also had an article yesterday talking about how in some towns you have this split between public schools and private schools. Many public schools have already announced that they're going to totally shut down, whereas private schools are opening up. So there you have another one of these splits that's adding to the anger and frustration for parents that are stuck in the public schools. And, the last thing I want to talk about is some of the polling of parents, of working parents, of young kids. There was a poll done in April of working parents of young kids, and they asked them how they were holding up as childcare providers and preschools shut down. The answer was obviously not great. But at the time, only 6% said that they expected that they would need to leave their jobs in order to care for their children. Half said they currently had some form of childcare, and 53% said they expected to change up their current situation in order to get more help from family members. So that wasn't good. But when the same polling firm repeated the poll just last month, so June, the situation had grown really, really bad. In the new poll, a full 27% of respondents said they expected to have to leave their job. 35% said they have some form of non-parental child care, and only 28% managed to get family help. So these stats are deteriorating. When you add to that, in the summer months, most summer camps, certainly the summer camps my kids usually go to, and they don't go to many. I usually do one each, but all of them were closed. And most summer camps are struggling or closing altogether. Summer camps tend to survive on a razor's edge here. They're not huge money makers, and they carry tons of liability. And so for many of them, I suspect it's just too hard to survive a summer of not operating. 40% of daycares are saying that they expect to close their doors permanently. What are parents going to do if their regular daycare closes and there isn't first of all, there isn't an obvious replacement, but also it seems like there's probably going just to be less less daycare centers out there, and then less competition. So that's a scary reality there. Coupled with the continued school shutdowns, because once your child gets to school age, you can take them out of daycare, and schools usually offer before care and after care. So you can, do a full day of work just using the services through the public schools and private schools. Many private schools also offer some sort of before care and after care. So here to talk about this a bit more are my two good friends, Jennifer Braceras and Carrie Lukas. Before we hear from them, let me give you just a quick bio on these two fabulous ladies. Carrie is the president of the Independent Women's Forum. She's the co-author of Liberty is No War on Women and the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Women, Sex, and Feminism. She is a writer for National Review, Forbes, and a number of other impressive publications, as well as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post. Jennifer, the equally impressive Jennifer Braceras, is the director of the Independent Women's Law Center. She is a former commissioner of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. She went to Harvard Law School, and she frequently contributes to the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe, The Hill, National Review Online. And Jennifer is actually joining us from vacation, so an extra big hand for Jennifer for joining us. Thank you, ladies, for coming on to the first episode of the Bespoke Parenting Hour.
No problem.
Thanks for having us on, Julie.
So Jennifer, I want to start with you. You wrote a piece about a month ago, talking about the data, talking about the impact on school closures and why schools should fully reopen this fall. Talk to me a little bit about that piece. It's very, very data heavy. You really provide parents some good information. I actually used your data to write a letter to my school board, which I'm sure was totally ignored, went straight into the trash or the shredder. But I think a lot of parents have used this information. I certainly have tweeted this out. So tell us a little bit about that. And then if you could also pivot to, do you think things have changed? Do you think, we can talk about that further, but first tell us a little bit about what you found when you were researching, the risk of COVID-19 to kids and schools.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, I started to collect the data just for myself and some other moms in my community when we were preparing for a meeting with the superintendent. And we wanted to have the data at our fingertips. And so I started to put it together and organize it in this document, sort of by topic. And, well, as you know, I shared it with you, and you said, well, you should really publish this as a blog post because other people could use this information too, which was a great idea. So we put it up at IWF, and hopefully it's helped other parents find some of the resources as well, because there are a lot of long-form articles about it that, take a position one way or the other, but it's hard to just find bullet points that tell you what you need to know about specific things. The risk to kids of getting COVID, the risk to kids of getting seriously ill from COVID, the risk of them spreading it to each other, the risk of them spreading it to teachers. So I sort of went through each of these points and provide the information that shows that, they're at very low risk of getting it. They're at very low risk of becoming seriously ill from COVID. They are not super spreaders. They rarely spread it to each other or to adults. If anything, adults spread it to them, but usually only within the same household. And this, at the time, I felt like this was information that just wasn't really getting out, and there was a lot of fear amongst the parent community, and I wanted to try to dispel some of that fear.
Well, just for parents that are listening, I want to just give you a couple of the bullet points that Jennifer put in her piece. She divides it up also by, children and teens are much less likely than adults to contract COVID. And she has some bullet points there. For instance, international research confirms that the percentage of children among the confirmed COVID-19 patients is low, ranging from 1% in young children to 6% in older children. Mass General has said that children appear to have a lower attack rates than adults if exposed to COVID-19, are less likely to become infected. So, they might actually touch something that, has been, has, COVID-19, and they will not then become infected. You also go into the area of super spreaders, as you mentioned, and you give several links to Wall Street Journal articles, Dr. Scott Atlas, at the Hoover Institute, saying that children rarely transmit the disease to adults. We have a clip of him actually talking about that. Let's listen to that.
There is virtually zero risk to children for getting something serious or dying from this disease. Anyone who thinks schools should be closed is not talking about the risk to children. That's factually true, and they should say that. It has nothing to do with the children's risk. Now let's talk about the risk to teachers. Mm-hmm. The teachers are, because this is probably the big fear here, obviously. The teachers, first of all, are a young population in the United States. K through 12 teachers, half of them are under 41, 82% are under 55. These are not high-risk age groups. We know this by now. And it's true that there are high-risk teachers, and those teachers should be able to believe in their social distancing and masks like they do for every other essential business. When they go to the grocery store, for instance, they can teach using social distancing. And if they're still afraid, they can stay at home. There's no reason to lock up the children.
And, so there's just a tremendous amount of good news out there, of good data out there that should be reassuring people. But the closer we get to school openings, we're seeing more of the alarmism out there. President Trump talked about this as well. He and Secretary Betsy DeVos have been very clear that they want schools to open. Maybe we could listen to that clip as well.
Mothers can't go to work because all of a sudden they have to stay home and watch their child, and fathers. What's happening? There's a tremendous strain on that whole side of the equation.
So it's a balancing act.
It is a balancing act, but that we have to open our schools. Well, I also say a decision like that is politics.
So Jennifer, and I want Carrie to weigh in on this too, but Jennifer, just quickly, it's just talk a little bit about the political. Trump also mentioned the political aspect of this. What has the reaction been since Trump said that? He also mentioned the American Academy of Pediatrics, which came out, NPR called the American Academy of Pediatrics statement a firm endorsement of opening the schools. And then all of a sudden you see some, and so Trump mentions this and you see some, whoa, let's back up here. Tell me a little bit about the political aspect of this.
Yeah, I think we were moving in the right direction prior to the president weighing in. And then unfortunately, I think what happened is a lot of people, school administrators and teachers who don't particularly like the president, once they heard that he was for schools opening, they figured they had to be against it. And you had, writers like Jennifer Rubin tweeting out, Donald Trump wants to kill your kids, and completely over-politicizing it. And it's just insane. And what I try to tell people is this really shouldn't be political at all. I get it. If you don't like Donald Trump, that's fine. But even a stopwatch is right twice a day. And he is right about this, whether you agree with him on any other issue or not.
Right. Carrie, I want to talk to you a little bit. Carrie actually, for listeners, I didn't mention this in her bio, but Carrie actually lives in Germany. And so I thought bringing her on to talk about how things have been handled in Germany, where schools are open. I want Carrie to give a little bit of perspective on, I know the schools in Germany are open, so you can tell us about that. But, what are the conditions? Like, is there social distancing? Are the desks far apart? Is there cleaning stations? Give us a little insight into what's happened in Germany. And also just how was Germany about the subject of opening schools? Did you see this type of alarmism before it happened, or absolute resistance from, for instance, teachers unions and teachers in general?
Yeah, it has been really interesting because I think one thing that's been lost in the conversation about how different countries have approached this problem is the tremendous similarities. I felt like when COVID was first breaking out, there was this sense that Germany was doing everything right and America was doing everything wrong. And I was a little baffled because if you look at the timing of when Germany chose to close and kind of the extent of their lockdowns, I think you'll find a lot more similarities than differences. But one thing that's been definitely is an incredibly different thing is just how the public reacts to policymakers' decisions. When Germany first started reopening, which was, I believe in about early May, you started having some things open. And then by mid-May, my kids were back in school on a staggered schedule. And
wow, so
it went on like that for a little while.
Wait, so sorry to interrupt. So so in Germany, they reopened this. I think you had mentioned this to me. Carrie and Jennifer are very good friends of mine. So we do talk. We don't only talk during the podcast, but so your kid, so I'd forgotten. So your kids actually went back in essentially the spring, like to end the school year.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. They all started. It wasn't full time. So my kids are in elementary school and high school, and they started going back. A couple, kind of staggered, weird schedules. It was definitely different. They had, as soon as the kids walked in, they had to wash their hands, and then instead of changing classrooms, they were more confined to one desk. So classes were smaller. So it was definitely a very different experience. But I feel like everybody in Germany, the focus has been getting life back to normal, and it's not considered political. But I think one thing that's I find it makes me sad as an American that there was no sense. I feel like the Germans were very much like they want things to reopen, but with the idea that heaven forbid something went wrong, they could reverse course and nobody would be calling people murderers or just
Right.
There wouldn't be the kind of vitriol you see in the States where anybody who opens and it goes badly, you feel like. There's just such a horrible perception of it. So I do think that Germany has a lot more leeway when it comes to making these decisions.
Well, you're right. It seems like I think that's why some people are very afraid of this, is because if something goes wrong, they're afraid of, and certainly local school administrators who have really frustrated me. And, I talked about it earlier about my own school district not telling parents what is going on, and that does make me mad. But in some ways, Carrie, you make a good point that part of the reason they're not saying anything is that they don't want to have to reverse and make people mad or announce and then proceed. And then when they see things like Jennifer Rubin saying people calling to open schools want to kill kids, that does make it very very difficult to ultimately make any kind of decision. But I will say it's kind of interesting, though, when you look, I look at Jennifer's data, I look at, a statement from the American Academy of Pediatrics and most pediatricians saying that, schools are really important and mentally children are kind of suffering now. I also think that it's really important because online learning is it's terrible. It does not work. It does not work for the vast majority of kids. New York Times has been doing some pretty amazing reporting on this, talking about how the ones that are hurt the most in online formats are minority and poor children. This is pretty obvious to us. So what frustrates me a little bit is that when you politicize it and say, you open schools, you're going to murder kids, it doesn't allow you to consider these other variables, which are really important, like that kids are suffering.
Yeah, Julie, if I can jump in, sorry to talk, Jennifer. This is Carrie again. I think that one thing that I don't want to throw online learning under the bus. I think that there are some families for whom it works well. I think there are opportunities to incorporate it. But it's funny if you think back to just a few months ago, before COVID became a thing. The things we were worried about when it came to kids, we already had a problem in the developed world with worrying about kids spending too much time online, worrying about their mental health, worrying about things like obesity, whether or not they were going to, their motivation levels, substance abuse. And here we are. It's funny. I feel like now, this was the big focus. Michelle Obama, all she talked about was how kids were not exercising enough and needed to get out of the house more. And now here we are. And it seems as though we don't care about anything other than COVID. And obviously it's a big problem. There's real risks. I definitely think school administrators should be monitoring things, make sure that they're taking care of vulnerable populations, be ready to close if something crazy happens, have the leeway to close. But man, aren't we worried about any of these things anymore? Or are we really just willing to sacrifice our kids, a year of our kids' lives, incredibly important times developmentally, and just say, nope, you get to do absolutely nothing other than sit there and stare at a computer for the next 9 months. That seems really kind of sad.
I want to expand on that a little bit, but Jennifer, I wanted to give you a chance because I heard you were going to mention something as well.
Well, no, I mean, I agree with Carrie 100%. I think the data is clear that, that this has had an effect on anxiety and depression levels, particularly amongst teens in the United States. And, people really are forgetting that education isn't just about content delivery. I mean, kids go to school and they learn from their peers and they learn from face-to-face interactions with adults. And they're not just learning the content, they're learning, social and emotional things. And that's all been taken away from them with online learning. It doesn't mean that online learning can't be, a piece of it or our school offers virtual high school for kids that can't get into a certain class. They can take something online that's offered by a content provider. I mean, there are lots of ways to incorporate online learning into the curriculum, but it cannot take the place of face-to-face interactions with other adults and kids. It just can't.
Right. One thing that really bothers me, and I've noticed this with my own school district, is the utter lack of curiosity and lack of creativity in looking at this new reality. So you have a situation where what I'm seeing from school districts, and I mentioned this earlier, but Arlington, which is the city right next to us, announced they gave them only 3 days to decide and gave them two choices. It was either your child goes to school for a longer period, well, I think it was probably 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours, and you do intensive learning in those 2 days, but it's in person, it's in the school building. And that was one choice. And the rest of the week, those remaining 3 days, there's nothing. Or you do a 4-day online course, and it's entirely online. And so parents are really struggling because it's pretty much like it's a Sophie's choice. They're both awful, right? Like, which one do I choose? And what's so interesting to me is I've really found it fascinating how good the coverage is in the New York Times on this issue, because they've been doing a lot on sort of the equity question, which can sometimes get bogged down in social justice kind of language. But this is really interesting how they're talking about how, like I mentioned, minority and poor children are really suffering. And so they have actually been thinking creative. The New York Times has been thinking creatively and talking about school districts should be hiring armies of college students that are interested in taking a gap year. Or my dad is brilliant. He's an engineer. He's a retired engineer. He's incredibly bright in terms of science, and put a call out to retired people. Hey, want to come? And you don't necessarily have to have an education degree. And then set up, really creative ways of learning outside, learning in a gymnasium, and or actually deploying teachers into neighborhoods for small groups, sort of bubble groups of students who, again, there could be a parent who hosts it. But this would take a lot of curiosity and a lot of creativity. And I find that, what the schools are doing is they're just giving parents the same awful options that are no different from the spring. And so a lot of people are frustrated that in this time, we started chatting about, COVID shutdowns in February and March. They've had a lot of time. And then, here come the fall plans, and they're no different and no better than the spring plans. So that's what's really frustrating to me. There's a lot.
Well, I hate to say it, Julie, but a lot of that is because of the unions. Because
right,
of the
of course.
Union.
Absolutely. I should have said that from the beginning. And talk to me about, the teachers unions are now, I think I'm right here, Jennifer, that the teachers unions are now calling for like basically a total shutdown, or, no in-person, no going to school until February or January, I think is what I heard.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I live in Massachusetts, and, where we live, most of the teachers, I think, do want to go back. They recognize it's frustrating for them to try to deliver the content online, to not look their students in the eye and have that accountability piece. But the unions are don't necessarily represent the wishes of their members. And the Massachusetts Teachers Association has been horrible on this. I mean, they are essentially saying that nobody should go back until the federal government passes X, Y, and Z legislation to give them more money to do this, to do that, until we redesign the curriculum, to incorporate Black Lives Matter stuff. I mean, they're basically throwing up every roadblock possible to keep the schools closed.
Yeah. It's interesting. We've all talked about, especially people in that follow sort of the homeschooling community, how interesting it is to see people who normally would never be interested in homeschool learning, or even take 5 minutes to learn about it, are suddenly considering it for their families. And you're starting to see frustration. I'm getting, it's funny. I live in a city where you don't gripe and you don't complain about city officials and city services. But I get a lot of private messages, and people are saying things like, I'm paying property taxes for the schools to educate my children, and now I'm getting substandard, or my child has an IEP. He has special needs, and there's no way they can fulfill his IEP. IEPs are specialized educational services for kids with special needs. They are the schools are legally bound to meet those needs and to do whatever they can. And if they can't, they are supposed to pay for that child to go to another school or to get certain services. I mean, they will even pay if you need your child to go to a certain public school because certain services are offered there, but they aren't they don't live in that in that area. You can require the school to pay for transportation. I know families who've had taxis paid for by the school district. So there is this legal question too about, extremely gifted children and IEP students that normally need special services and that cannot possibly be, accommodated under these circumstances. So you're seeing parents now suddenly go, boy, I wish I had more choices, or I sure do wish that they'd give me my money back that I could put towards tutoring. So I do think it's kind of interesting how we're seeing a real sort of awakening to the possibilities out there. Carrie, go ahead.
Julie, one thing, if I can jump in and say is, I think that when you, one thing that's disturbing, I think about a lot of this conversation and a lot of what's going on kind of surrounding the education is how little, how much the kids seem to be, and education seems to be secondary.
Right.
I feel like so much of the school conversation is about the vulnerabilities of teachers. Not to get you wrong. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly important, and there's a lot of hardworking, dedicated teachers out there who, shouldn't be pushed out of their jobs. They need to find ways to incorporate them. But the kind of innovative thing we were talking about earlier with bringing in some recent college grads who obviously there's a huge problem with them lacking employment. There are a lot of things you can do. I do have the sense in Germany that there is a focus that this actually really matters. That and that even the kind of default that the freedom of movement. Government should be, if you're not sure which to do, if there's a question of, or should we open, should we not open? And I think, my gosh, as Americans, we're supposed to be the land of the free, for heaven's sakes. There should be a basic, if you're not sure, then people should be free. Like we should not tell people they have to, that they have to do something. So I do think that when it comes to some of this, it's sad to me that we seem, so much of America, and especially when it comes to this school thing, is now like do no harm. And if that means locking kids in, tying them, with sticking a laptop or a Game Boy in their hands for the next 9 months, that's an okay default. That really shouldn't be. We should be figuring out ways to get people, life is for living, not just for, sitting safely in front of a computer.
Yeah, and there is something about a quality of life. I mean, living isn't just sitting there and breathing. It's a quality of life, and for children, it's educating
Exactly.
them and making and getting them ready to be citizens of the world. I also think it's really interesting, and I feel like this is a whole nother bespoke parenting hour. We'll have to get into this. I'll keep you guys on for 2 more hours if I go too far down this route. But it's interesting to me that and I wrote an op-ed on this for the USA Today, about the sort of the other services that are being offered through the so-called closed schools. Okay. Continued school meal distribution is one thing that when COVID shut down, you had people going, oh my gosh, kids are going to starve. Now, okay, we should all be asking ourselves, why, right? I mean, look at the number of social services now provided through the schools. I mean, part of the reason people are freaking out is because they have to work outside the home, and essentially, if they can't send their kids to school, they don't have they don't have essentially daycare for their kids, right? And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking just about the teaching itself. I'm talking about, like, there is before care. I can drop my kids off at, I think, 6:30 a.m. without breakfast. Not only will they watch them, they will feed them. I can leave my kid at aftercare until I think around 7, and they will feed them. Okay, there are wellness centers in schools. There are daycares for children who have babies in schools. All sorts of, condom distribution and other things. Schools have become essentially social centers, social service centers. And so, it's interesting to have watched the panic on a lot of, the panic from people when schools shut down. And, should schools really be doing all of this stuff? I mean, it's obvious why education is secondary to a lot of these folks, because education has been secondary for a long time. Schools do a lot of things outside educating. And so it really is, again, I think this is a whole wider issue that we should dedicate a podcast to, but it really has, I think, shown just what a mess our educational system is. So I want to wrap up here by just asking, maybe Jennifer, you could give me a sense of, we have seen an uptick in the number of infections, and of course the media won't at all mention this, but that is largely due to the demonstrations we saw after George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matter protests, and some of the violence that we've seen and of large group gatherings. So that is going to scare people, and I think that's going to strengthen the argument to keep schools closed or to go entirely online. How do you feel about this uptick, and do you think that there's any way that schools will open despite this?
I think the only relevant question when it comes to schools is not whether there's been an uptick in the general population, but whether there's been an uptick in schools and daycare centers that have reopened. And the answer is that there hasn't been. And so, if there's an uptick in the general community because, a bunch of college students, went to some bar, or because some people went to some protest, that has nothing to do with the question we're trying to address here.
Right.
The question we're trying to address here is, will there be a danger in opening schools? And the answer is very clearly no. You can look at the daycare centers in New York City that stayed open for essential workers the entire time. Teachers did not get sick. Teachers did not die from exposure to children. It just didn't happen. And, we keep pitting the teachers against the kids. Well, okay, what about the teachers with underlying conditions? What about the teachers that are older? And the fact of the matter is, yes, they have to take precautions, as Carrie said they've been doing in Germany. Mostly they need to take precautions from each other. They can't sit next to each other in the teacher's lounge. They can't take their masks off in front of, each other, because it does transmit adult to adult. But the fact of the matter is that teachers are at very low risk of getting this disease from going back to school.
Yeah. Well, Carrie, you're coming back soon, and your kids are probably going to, have to go back to sort of, that COVID type schooling. You're probably not looking forward to that.
Yeah, we are staring into moving back to the United States this fall, most likely, and it's funny. It's the kids. Kids moves are already always hard on kids, but boy, when you're going from fully open schools, which is our kids' school here in Berlin is expected, planning to open fully functional. I'm sure there'll be some kind of additional like spacing, and they're going to be encouraging kids to wash hands. So there's no mask expectations or anything, but that's starting in mid-August. The kids are supposed to be back. Kids here in Berlin will be back in full-time school, and my kids are thinking about going back to the States, where we're going to be in at best, once or twice a week in-person regime, and with masks and no sports. My kids are at sports as we're speaking. Yeah. My kids are at a lacrosse camp. It's a wonderful thing. It's the kids. It's really been healthy for them. It was hard when they were all home, and they're dreading the idea of having to be back in that environment. So it's worrying.
Well, and there's no time now, but Jennifer, you also have college-age kids, and there's a struggle there too with what will college look. I think it's also.
We could do a whole nother hour on that, Julie. Don't get me started. They're bringing them back and putting them in prisons. Essentially,
I think I will fully ruin your vacation if I make you talk about that. So we will skip that topic. But I will say, just from I think all of us are very, very lucky because we work from home. IWF, the women of IWF work from home, and we have a tremendous amount of flexibility. That said, I did enjoy 8 hours of quiet time at my house. My biggest annoyance was when the dog scratched the door to go out. So I am actually locked in my bedroom right now. I have a lovely desk downstairs, and where I could be doing this podcast, but I'm sort of locked in my room and desperately hoping that the dog doesn't paw on the bedroom door, or that a kid doesn't come in and beg me to make him scrambled eggs. So there are complications with this, and it doesn't look like there's any ending to it. So, ladies, thank you for coming on today. You are my first guests for the premiere episode of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Julie.
So that was a great conversation with Carrie and Jennifer, and I think it really highlights just how difficult this is for children to be out of school, to be out of their social sort of interactions with other kids, to be out of their routines. Parents are frustrated, particularly working parents, really worried about things. But I do think I want to leave this podcast on giving people some perspective that, it's obvious that kids today are experiencing something completely different from anything they've ever experienced before. But other generations have experienced similar frightening, upsetting, sort of schedule disrupting hardships. And I think it's always good to kind of put things in perspective. I often do this with moms when they worry about, occasionally taking a break, using a shortcut, putting a frozen pizza in the fridge, and they're just riddled with guilt. And I tell them, look, 100 years ago, so many kids died of malnutrition. We're very lucky to have these conveniences, and life is different and life is busier. And so I want to kind of give people a little bit of perspective on that, that in recent history, just the past 100 years. So that is very recent history. Kids have experienced war, food shortages, and hardships we can't even imagine today. During the Great Depression, 34 million men, women, and children were entirely without income. There was no safety net. This was 28% of the American people then, and 250,000 children were homeless. At least 1 in 5 were deeply, deeply despondent and very seriously hungry and malnourished. Many of them did not have adequate clothing. I think it's really important to understand the condition of children during the Depression and immediately after it. It was a really horrible time in our history, and children suffered terribly. In some regions, especially coal mining regions, as many as 90% of children were terribly malnourished. We've seen the pictures. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the pictures taken by Dorothea Lange and Marion Post Walcott, Lewis Hine. These are heartbreaking photographs, and they capture the physical and emotional toll that these terrible living conditions took on children. In the 1930s, we had our first child labor laws, and that was great. That was a really positive sign. But when you read about this, you realize that this was not because of an altruistic desire to help these kids. It was because too many kids were competing with adults for menial jobs. So I leave you with this image because I think that it's important to remember that kids are strong, that parents are strong, that this country has been through terrible things before. We have survived. We have grown stronger. Today, we have a lot of services in place to help people, sort of the social safety net, to prevent these kinds of horrors that happened in the Great Depression. So I just wanted to leave you with a little bit of perspective. We will get through this. It will get better. And eventually, we will return our children to school. Thanks, everyone, for being here for another episode of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. If you enjoyed this episode or like the podcast in general, please leave a rating or review on iTunes. This helps ensure that the podcast reaches as many listeners as possible. If you haven't subscribed to the Bespoke Parenting Hour on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, please do so you won't miss an episode. Don't forget to share this episode and let your friends know that they can get Bespoke episodes on their favorite podcast app. From all of us here at the Independent Women's Forum, thanks for listening.